matter where we went after the storm hit, you'd find Vermonters who'd lost everything, who'd lost their homes, their belongings, everything materially that they cared about. And after I'd give them a hug and give them some support, they'd turn to me and say, Governor, 9 times out of 10, there's someone across the road who got hit harder than I did, and I got to go help them out. And that's been the spirit of this recovery, remarkable generosity.
When a community comes together, there is literally nothing they can't accomplish. Very often you'll hear a couple of old wives' tales, and number one of them is that during a disaster or a crisis, the people will panic. People will not panic. All the people are looking for is some direction and some leadership.
Irene was worse than the flood of 1927. And so I think that all of Vermont turned out to help.
A neighbor, right, one of the neighbors that were affected, like an hour later, just came with 2 other volunteers and pumped my basement. And I was just like, I just had to sit in the corner and cry, and I was grateful.
I started getting reports from southern Vermont, where I was born and raised, from my brother talking about places that he had just driven through in Windham County that he was describing to me around our farm as flooded out. And I said, Jeff, that's impossible. There's not even much of a brook there. He said, I'm just telling you, I couldn't get through there in my 3/4 ton 4-wheel drive truck. By midnight, we were evacuating our state hospital. We'd evacuate our biggest state office complex in Waterbury.
225 communities, 45 of them severely. 1,400 homes were impacted, countless roads, bridges. We've lost many of our covered bridges here in Vermont.
Oh my God.
So the impact was really staggering. People lost their homes, their businesses, and in many cases, their entire communities and neighborhoods.
Long-term recovery is incredibly more complicated. It is incredibly complex, and it is long-term.
Well, the long-term recovery conversations and community efforts really is an example where FEMA has the experience to come in and say to a state like Vermont, hey, this has worked in the past, and we think it could be applied to Vermont by your community-based local government volunteers that want to keep the rebuilding happening. And basically what it's allowed us to do is enter into a dialogue with communities, with our regional planning commissions, with our local select boards, with our mayors where we have them, and with our volunteer base to ensure that we are tailoring a recovery package for that community that makes sense for them. And that's really important.
The Vermont Long-Term Disaster Recovery Group was created to both raise funds and allocate funds from the Vermont Disaster Relief Fund. The governor and his office pulled together and helped incorporate our group, the Vermont Long-Term Disaster Recovery Group. And as part of that, the governor got 3 appointees, and Vermont VOAD, Volunteer Organizations Active in a Disaster, got 3 appointees to give the new board a real balance.
Any new group, there's always a lot of challenges out there, and we've had our challenges because we're at the state level, and recovery starts at the local level. So we have local committees that have been set up, in some cases one-town committees, in other cases regions, counties, etc. So there's a number of different groups out there. In Vermont, small as we are, there's about 40, maybe even 50 other organizations we have to coordinate with. So that's a real challenge.
We had a huge chore when our group was formed, in that we had to create our structure, our organization, our purpose from whole cloth. Nothing existed.
Vermont VOAD have the feet and the boots on the ground, and so we have seen physically and visibly what the needs are.
Vermont VOAD is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, and really it's a group of groups that come together to respond to disasters when they happen.
We had community meetings, and we brought partners to the table that had services or assets that they could use, or that we could use rather, to help these people. So we called these committee committee meetings together, and we brought together CAP agencies, we brought together Department of Human Service, the food banks, the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, Council on Aging, volunteer groups, churches, anybody who pretty much could give either a physical item or time to flood clients.
The most important thing is it can't be like we are pushing things down. We really have to let things come up and deal with them together, not try to do something that we think is right without coordinating with the local community, because what fits in one community may not fit in the other community.
The role of Upper Valley Strong is, first of all, to gather the groups that are doing work in response to Irene, bring us together and connect us, help us talk together, work better together, find resources together, and serve the people who were affected by Tropical Storm Irene more effectively. Some of these community groups started doing storm-related work that wasn't originally what they were doing, and we started tripping across each other a little bit, hearing about each other's work, communicating a little better, and then this has coalesced more recently into this more formal entity.
In order for us to implement a lot of the recovery plans, recovery projects and initiatives, we need funding, we need talent, and we need capacity.
The state of Vermont, we feel, has an unmet need of about $30 million. Now, that's information that we're getting from various long-term recovery committees, but that seems like a reasonable amount. So that's a huge challenge. So part of our role and part of the state's role is how do we come up with that, because those monies are not available at the state level. So we've embarked on a fundraising campaign that will hopefully, by the first anniversary of this disaster, Tropical Storm Irene, we will have raised that amount of money.
Well, our goals in this recovery, there are a number of goals. One is to try to get as many resources focused on the floods in the right way as possible. Second is to make sure that when people make contributions that they're getting good and accurate information quickly, and that so high transparency about what's happening with those dollars. And the third is to work with our colleague organizations who are doing flood relief to make sure they're being transparent and they're being forthcoming in what they're doing. So it's about information, transparency, and building resources for the state.
We've been trying to stay close in touch with what's being developed through the long-term community recovery committees at the local level so that we can bring those resources to help folks implement what they're planning.
And I hate to say it, but the money really helps.
I think when we were first formed, our focus was more on, we thought we had to raise money and allocate money. We did not realize that a really big portion of our job going forward would be to coordinate the relief and the assessments, the case management, to create and coordinate a case manager system so flood survivors would be able to find a one-stop shop that could help them.
A disaster case manager helps survivors to create a comprehensive recovery plan and then advocates with service providers to help resource that plan. This provides our survivors with a single face to help them navigate all the complicated issues of recovery.
I think the governor felt, and rightfully so, that half of our battle as a long-term recovery group is communicating.
The case management process begins with kind of figuring out how many cases we have out there, or just even trying to find the cases. Some of the cases come directly to us, and some of the times we go out to find the cases. And the first thing I like to do is have a one-on-one meeting to really get to know the case, the client, or the family, and determine what they may need, what they went through, what their needs are, not just with the immediate need, but do they have dreams and hopes, or the whole picture. And that's kind of how it begins for me. And then it's like a puzzle.
Initially, you're thinking, it's me. And in all actuality, it's me and the person that lived next door and down the street and even 2 or 3 towns over. So while I'm dealing with just my immediate self and my family, it appears that the caseworker has her hands really full. And she's juggling not just me and my family, but like I said, my neighbor and the guy across the state, and also trying to manage the resources and getting those filtered into one spot. That way they're available for us.
The governor made it very specific that when we're all done helping Vermonters recover and rebuild from Irene, that we must continue to remain in place to wait for the next disaster, and we must raise some money that will be there waiting for the next disaster.
The flood basically threw me into fight mode because upon initial reaction, it seemed there was no one to help us. And so I found that I had a voice, and by voicing my concerns, the first concern being who's going to remove this home, we were able to get a lot of help.
I think my greatest lesson that I've learned from this experience is always my greatest focus is meeting needs and not letting anybody slip through the cracks. And I think the more you cooperate and collaborate with as many resources as you can, that's less likely to happen.
I think the greatest lesson is the need has been a reinforced lesson is that willingness to be flexible because those needs are always emerging, and so developing plans to meet those needs that are flexible enough to change and to move with the flow as it's happening has been the greatest lesson, and that really probably flows from the greatest challenge.
We've developed a template for the local long-term recovery committees, and we work with the local communities in doing that. We sit at the table with them, whether they need a fiscal agent like we use the United Way, whether they need a lawyer, we have lawyers that are available, whether they need an accountant, we have an accountant available to help them through that process. We make it work pretty easily.
I think talking to other states as they have disasters and sharing the lessons that we've learned, one of the most important things that they can remember is that they don't have to try to do it alone, that people can work together and overcome the challenges, and to not be afraid to reach out and to ask for help and ask for advice and just say, hey, what worked for you and how, and listen to what worked for others and then adapt it to what works for your own area.
I guess the most practical advice that I can give to another survivor of a flood or a disaster is to remain calm. Believe in yourself, keep your focus, and seek out the help that you need, because pride isn't going to take care of you.
One of the lessons from recovery work here is that it is incredibly important that survivors, whether it's a flood, a hurricane, tornado, whatever the disaster, that you keep your efforts, the recovery efforts, as simple as possible. And always think about what a survivor would think if you told them this. It's just really important. Keep it simple and never lose sight of the perspective of the survivor, because it's really important that you see things through their eyes.
Don't set a boundary for yourself. Reach out there and grab it. And don't take no for an answer. Know that you're worth it and reach for it.
And patience. It takes patience from all angles. It's a very difficult time to remember that, but the case manager needs to have patience with both the client and themselves in the process. And the client needs to have patience knowing that we are there for them and we are working, even though it may not always seem like we're doing it fast enough.
And the survivors should have patience with themselves as well.
Everybody needs lots and lots of patience.
Vermont suffered a body blow with Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. And I guess my hope through the long-term recovery process is 3 or 4 years down the road, people look back and they know that they suffered through something of historic proportions, but they think of it as history, not as something that is still going on and something they're still battling, that the people who were the survivors have moved on with their lives